Hello everyone out there, and welcome to Local Foods College. This session is called What the Pest Is It? So there's a bunch of stuff this time of year eaten in your garden, and you'd prefer to be the one eating out of your garden or picking out of your farm or garden. So today we'll be talking about some of the things that might be destroying your crops and what we can do about that. Here we are. We're at the University of Minnesota Extension. This is Local Foods College. We do this now every twice a year or so. And it's a great way we've found to bring our extension programming to people all over the state and the country. All right, so here we have Annie Klodd, Michelle Grabowski, who work for the University of Minnesota Extension, where they specialize in horticulture, production, and plant disease. And Courtney Tchida manages the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture Student Organic Farm. Three of them have decades of experience combined in sustainable production in garden and market crops and are dealing with myriad plant and pest diseases every day, just like all of us. All right, so now we will switch to our slides. So here's how this will work. We've prepared a slideshow to talk about some of the things that we are seeing in the fields. When we're done, we'll open it up to everybody here, and you can ask and chat all of your questions about what you're seeing in your fields and how we can deal with them. So let's give it a start here. All right, Courtney.
Yeah, so I wanted to just start with talking about some things you can do to start preventing diseases now, specifically in tomatoes. Something that I've been doing the last couple of years is a hot water bath treatment. We've had a lot of bacterial spot and speck over the years on our tomatoes, and I'm trying to reduce that, especially on the seeds that we're saving for next year. And part of that can be done by picking the seeds, the fruits that have the least amount of disease present in them to begin with. But then also in that last step of doing seed saving, where you collect the seeds, you put them in a little cup with some water, let them ferment for a week or so, and then when you rinse off the seeds so that you have just the seeds, all of that like slimy goo on the seed coat comes off in the fermentation process. And while the seeds are still wet, you can actually do this hot water bath treatment using a sous vide or a fancy hot water bath, but most people don't have those. But people are more and more getting these sous vides, which is actually like a cooking implement that makes a hot water bath for cooking food. You can actually cook your tomato seeds. So we just take little Dixie cups, some sort of like mesh gauze that goes over the top in rubber bands, put the seeds inside, start out at 10 minutes at 100 degrees, and then follow that with 25 minutes up at 122 degrees, and then rinse them off really good in some cold water, and then you can store them for the next season. Or you can wait and do this process in the springtime and plant them at that point when you're ready to plant them. We've also been doing this last year. We actually did a bleach treatment. We had some, I would say, like maybe we did a big investigative, like tested a whole bunch of seeds for tomato mosaic virus, and we found that a few of our varieties actually had the tomato mosaic virus, and we were trying to get rid of that. And so we did a bleach treatment on our seeds right before we planted them. We 2.7% sodium hypochlorite, which is really just a fancy name for bleach. And then we did that for about 30 minutes, and then rinsed them with cool water and planted them immediately last spring. And this is sort of just a good way to start thinking about preventing diseases, specifically in tomatoes, but these can both be done for other seeds as well. I know that there's a lot of brassicas you can do the hot water bath treatment on. There's different temperatures for those, but yeah. If there are any questions about that, we could talk about it now, or we could save them for later. Otherwise, we can move on to the next slide. Another thing that we've been dealing a lot with is thistles. The thistle, we typically just tend to have thistles in our fields. It's something that I'm constantly trying to battle and get rid of. This year we ended up having a big chunk of the field that I wasn't expecting to have as many thistles in as we had. You can see in that picture on the left there, all the thistles that were proliferating this spring. And so we took a couple different tactics to control those this year. The first was we got a billboard from a friend. It was like a 20 by 50 foot billboard, and we put it down on top of the down the corners, and then just let it bake the soil and the thistles and everything underneath it. And you can see the picture right underneath the picture of the billboard was like pulling back the corner, and basically after about 2 months, it actually killed everything underneath it. Last year, I'd actually tried solarizing with a clear plastic tarp on a patch of thistles. It was maybe like 10 by 50 feet, and that actually worked really well too. It took about 2 months. It killed off all the thistles underneath. We basically just put down the plastic and buried all the edges. This was nice because you didn't have to bury the edges. You could just lay the billboard down, and it's a little bit sturdier and held up better over time. We've had it now in about 4 different spots on the farm this year to kill off thistles, to kill off kind of weedy grasses that are super invasive and you just don't want to have to deal with. And it's super effective. You have to have a lot of billboards if you have a very large space, but for smaller spaces and patches, it works really well. The other thing that we did is we planted buckwheat and sorghum Sudan grass. So the last picture there on the right is the picture of the buckwheat on the left and the sorghum Sudan grass on the right. And the sorghum Sudan grass got probably, 12 feet, 10 feet tall. Got really, really tall. It definitely smothered out all the thistles. There are no thistles in that field anymore. The buckwheat, again, it also got really thick and lush, probably only about 4 feet tall, but still super good at smothering out the thistles. So these are some organic control methods. You have to like take the field out of production for a little bit, but we actually ended up putting lettuce and some broccoli where we had the billboard later in the summer, and then we're able to get a crop off of it still. So it's a way that you can sort of manage these things in a season, essentially. I can't think of any other ways to kill thistles in one season than these 2 options. So that's exciting. And then the last one. The main pest that I would say that we've dealt with the most this season is Colorado potato beetles. They seem to come every year in waves. Some years they're really bad, some years they're not so bad. This year I would say they were probably about average. They weren't really, really horrible, but they were definitely present. So you can see the eggs in the top left corner there, the larva in the bottom left corner. The adult is actually in that middle section there. And then there's actually a predator of the Colorado potato beetle that we found out in the field that was munching on the Colorado potato beetle larva and eggs and adults. And so that was really exciting to see some of the good predators out there. And Annie, you might remember better than me what the name of that one is. I think it's like an assassin beetle or something like that. But anyway, the one thing that we've done to manage the Colorado potato beetles is going through, and as soon as they show up, we start hand picking and scouting, and we do that weekly. After the first week, we pick all of the adults off. We pick all the leaves that have any eggs on them off. We pull off any of the larvae, just putting them in a big bucket of soapy water and drowning the insects, because that's an easy way to manage them. And then after that first week, we go back through and we'll spray with spinosad. Spinosad's a approved organic pesticide that you can use on Colorado potato beetles, and it's fairly effective. It basically gives the insects a really bad cold and kills them, which is nice. And so we would go back once a week and spot spray any spots where the eggs had hatched and the larva was present, pulling off any adults again and just grounding them or squishing them in the field. Sometimes it's nicer to drown them and squish them because it can get sticky. But yeah, that's what I got for you.
Hey, by the way, that insect that you were talking about, that's the predator. The predatory stink bug is the one with the red on the corners.
Awesome.
All right, we have a question here. Let me get to the chat. I bought 40 by 100 silage tarp for the thistle area. Do I place this as soon as the snow melts in the spring or this fall?
I think you could do it either time. I'd be a little nervous to see how it holds up underneath the snow. In the spring might make more sense, first thing as soon as the snow melts, just because then you don't have to worry about it overwintering and what damage it might happen to it with the extreme weather. But yeah.
You also might just end up with a lot of ponding on top of it over the winter, so I'm not sure what the benefit would be of putting it down this fall.
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right. Do you want to take it over, Annie?
Michelle, actually, this is mine.
These are Michelle's. Sorry.
Yep. So yeah, everyone, this is Michelle Grabowski, and I get the plant disease questions from Extension. And one disease that we saw quite a bit of this year was basal downy mildew. So a lot of pesto makers that were very disappointed. And basically, if you're looking at your crop and you see that you've got sort of a yellowing of the leaves and the tips turning brown, you can tell the plants here look just kind of thin. What you want to do is get up close and look at the leaves. And with basal downy mildew, the yellowing often starts in between two of the big veins. So you can see a couple of these how the infection is limited. And then when you flip those leaves upside down, they actually look dusty or dirty right below where you saw the yellowing on the upper leaf surface. So Greg, go ahead and flip us to the next slide here. So this pathogen is actually an interesting one. The downy mildew doesn't survive here in Minnesota's winter, which means when we see it, it was brought into the state. And so this is a pathogen that can contaminate the seed. It also can come in on infected transplants, and it's even been found on fresh basil leaves for sale in the grocery store, where they're harvested and they look clean, and then the pathogen develops in the grocery store, and you can open it up and see that kind of grayish sporulation on the lower leaf surface. Once it's here, it actually moves around on moist air currents. So particularly around rain events and things like that, all of those grayish spores on the lower leaf surface can get carried into new plantings. So if you saw this disease very early in the season, early in June sometime, I would be suspicious of your seed or suspicious of the transplants that you had. If it didn't come in until later in the growing season, end of July, August, then it's more likely that it was carried from an infected plant somewhere nearby. And they can travel quite a long distance, so we're not talking about next door. If you've got storm events, they can move actually across states. So the spores can move long distances, and unfortunately what we know is that all of our basils can become infected to some extent, and the sweet basil, the one that is most prized for pesto and Italian cooking, is the most susceptible, and we see the most severe infection, the leaves yellow, and it moves very quickly through the entire plant, and the plant basically goes down and you're done harvesting off of it. There are a few types of basil that are less susceptible, so they still get it, but it doesn't become as severe. They're not great replacements, though. So the lemon basil, the red leaf basils, so the ones that have that purpley hue to them, the purpurescence, so red leaf or red Reuben, and then the blue spice basils also hold up against it. But again, you have to think about your market and whether they would be happy with one of these alternative basils. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. So for management, again, if you did see disease very early this season, if you have seed left over, I would get rid of that seed because it is possible that it came in on infected seed. You want to start out with good quality seed from a reliable supplier. If you're purchasing transplants, make sure you inspect those transplants, check the lower leaf surface to make sure they look clean. And then, unfortunately, a lot of what we need to do is just kind of reduce humidity around the plants. So making sure you have a wide row width and good spacing between the plants, using drip irrigation, anything you can do to kind of keep the foliage dry. If you do find it earlier in the season, basically you would take the plant that's infected and bury it as quickly as possible to prevent those spores from spreading. And there have been a couple trials looking at this with fungicides, but unfortunately what they found is that you have to start spraying before the disease arrives, and if the weather is very favorable for disease, so we have a lot of rain and a lot of moisture, then the fungicides are going to fail. So typically we don't recommend fungicides unless you know, absolutely necessary. In most cases we try to use preventative practices or just accept the loss when it does come in. And unfortunately this year we lost a lot of basil. Go ahead to the next one. So I wanted to put in late blight of tomato. We actually did not see a lot of this year, but I got a lot of questions about it because we had a lot of late blight last year. So late blight does not survive well in Minnesota. I'll tell you a couple exceptions. But again, it has sort of a fluffy white spores on the lower surface of the leaves. And what will happen is you'll see kind of large dead areas on the leaves, on the stems, when it can move really quickly in wet weather, and the whole plant can go down and look very blighted. And you have these firm brown sort of greasy spots on the tomato fruit, which of course makes them unmarketable. Go ahead to the next. And so here you can see when you cut open a late blight infected tomato, the discoloration extends into the fruit, but it's firm. It's not that soft sort of mush you'll sometimes see. And sometimes we get the fluffy white growth on the fruit itself when humidity is high. So what we know about this pathogen is it thrives in really cool, wet weather. And so the previous growing season, we actually had really regular rains. We had cooler temperatures. So we had seen a lot of it. This year, it was found in Otter Tail County in July. But what happened is shortly after it was first identified in Minnesota, we had several periods where we had up to 10 to 12 days, depending where you were in the state, with no rain, and it was very hot for the latter part of the summer as well. And all of those factors will really slow down this pathogen and prevent it from spreading. And so that's what we saw. We know it was around. If you saw it in your particular vegetables, you may have had local climate conditions that were favorable to it, but it would also be something that I would seriously look at. You know, what are your cultural practices, and is there anything you can do to keep those plants dry and keep air circulation around those plants? So as I said, the late blight pathogen does not survive very well in Minnesota. It needs to be somewhat protected. So it will go to potato and tomato. So if there's infected potatoes left in coal piles, sometimes just the mass of that pile will keep it warm enough to survive. The same thing if you had a lot of infected plant material in a warmer compost pile. So if you had infected plants, you would actually want them to be on the soil frozen, and that'll kill the pathogen off before the next growing season. Go ahead to the next. And then as you're looking to purchase your plants for next year, it can come in on potato seed. And so you would want to look for certified disease-free potato seed to make sure you're starting out with healthy plants and you don't want something going from potatoes to tomatoes and back. If you purchase transplants of tomatoes, make sure, again, you're inspecting those plants, looking for any symptoms, any soft discolored areas on the stems or leaves. Would indicate that you could have some kind of an infection on that plant before it got going. And then during the growing season, if we see this, what we want to do is promptly kill that plant so it can actually be killed with flame, herbicide, or just buried underground to make sure that all those airborne spores are not blown through your field and spread to the rest of the plant. And there are a few disease-resistant varieties. So if this has been a reoccurring problem in your area, maybe you have a very moist microclimate in your space, in that case, you can consider some of the resistant varieties that are available. Next slide. Okay, we did see a fair amount of leaf spots and blights. So on all of our vegetable diseases, there's a number of fungi and bacteria that will infect the foliage, and what happens is they'll survive in last year's plant debris, they'll get splashed up onto the lower leaves, and then those leaf spots will create either new fungal spores or new bacteria that are spread with the next rain event or irrigation splashing on those plants. And so you very quickly go from 10 leaf spots to 100 leaf spots, and as it progresses through the season, you can get a lot of leaf spot, and it can move in some cases as to a fruit spot as well. So on tomatoes, we see septoria, early blight, and bacterial spot. And all three of these were definitely present this season. I had questions about them. But again, compared to previous growing seasons like 2016, 2017, where we had rain events pretty much every week, in some cases every 3 days, in those years, these diseases really became very problematic and devastated plants by the end of the season. This past growing season, we had a couple of periods where we had these 10 to 12 days of dry weather, where things were hot, they were dry, the foliage was dry. And so although we had some of these diseases, they didn't seem to progress to the level of severity as they have in more wet years where we have more frequent rain events. Next slide. So unfortunately, we can't control how much rain we're going to get each season, but it is important to set yourself up for success. And so one of the key things that we do recommend with this is making sure you have a good system in place so that you are mulching, staking, and spacing your plants so that you have good air circulation through the field and you're preventing splash from the soil onto the plants. It's important to rotate your tomatoes. So many of the fungal leaf spot diseases, you want a good 3 to 4 year rotation, and the bacteria at least a 2-year rotation. So moving away from the tomatoes. And then you can see in these tomatoes that they were staked up, but then also the lower leaves were pinched off. And that's a way to remove any early leaf spots that might be forming in the field. You want to pull those out of the field. It creates good air circulation below the plants, and it makes it harder for any fungi in the soil to get splashed onto the lower leaves. And it's also important to understand that tomatoes don't have to be 100% free of leaf spot diseases to have the kind of yield that you would like out of them. And there's actually studies showing that they can tolerate up to 50% leaf loss by mid-August without yield loss. So using good cultural control practices to kind of keep those in check in order to keep enough green tissue on that plant, it can be a good strategy. Next slide. I think this is my last one. So this is a disease that we see fairly commonly in Minnesota. It's a fusarium, is a soil-borne fungus, so it lives in the ground, and it infects any of the allium, so onion, garlic, shallot, and it moves into the basal plate. So that's the circle at the bottom of the bulb that the roots are emerging from. And you can see on the shallot there sort of that fluffy white fungal growth. And then on the purple onions there, all of that tan area is actually soft and rotten. And so I was asked about this by a grower who had kind of a low spot in her field. And the plants, the onions there were very stunted. They weren't putting on good bulb size. And you can see the tips were dying back quite prematurely. And when we pulled these up, we barely got any roots to come out of the soil. Most of the roots were broken and rotted off. And then once we peeled back a couple of the outer layers, you could really clearly see the rot on those plants. So an important piece on this is making sure you don't plant in that soil with the alliums for at least 3 years to let the fungal population drop down. And then there are some resistant and tolerant varieties that can be used as well when you do finally go back into that spot. Next slide. There we go. Annie, take it away. All right. Thanks. I just have 4 different issues here to talk about, and then once I'm done, we'll take questions. So first I'm going to talk about spotted winged Drosophila, and then I'll go on to Japanese beetle after that. Spotted winged Drosophila are these invasive fruit flies, like what you see there on the right. And even though we have a lot of different fruit flies in Minnesota, the distinguishing factor that's the most obvious on spotted wing is the spot on their wing. There's a black spot on their wing, unlike some other fruit flies. So what spotted winged Drosophila is, and you've probably heard about it in the past few years, this fly inserts its larvae into berries such as raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, cherries, and grapes, and we found that it can even get cherry tomatoes. Basically any fruit that has a really thin skin that's nice and juicy inside, they really like. And this insect will lay an egg in one berry and then go on to the next one. So they can infect a large area of fruit in a relatively small amount of time. In the left, that is about the size of a spotted winged Drosophila. That little white larvae there is an SWD larvae, so you can kind of see how small they are. In order to find them in fruit, one way is you can go out and you might need to take, a hand lens to look up close, but you can dig into the fruit and try to find them there. So if you see raspberries or strawberries out in your garden that are looking mushy, you can dig in there and try to find them. You can also suspend them in vinegar to, make like a mash of the berry, and they will float to the top. You can also put out SWD traps, which can be made with cups of apple cider vinegar in order to catch them, and that is not a control mechanism because it will catch a few, but there will still be a lot out there. Putting out those traps, though, is a good way to scout and see how many spotted winged Drosophila you have and if they're present yet in your garden or on your farm. So there's a lot of research going on at the university about the best ways to control spotted winged Drosophila, particularly organic or non-chemical methods. And so one piece of research that's going on is looking at ways to exclude SWD from the crop. So what that means is putting a low tunnel or putting fabric around the raspberries or whatever it may be to actually keep them out. And this is challenging, but it can be effective also if it really does keep them out. It's got to be secure all around the plants in order to keep them out, but then when you pick up the cover, that still does allow the SWD to get in there. So it's not a 100% effective method, but it is one way that we can help reduce how much they're affecting the berries. The second big piece of advice is to harvest frequently. And this is so that if you have a lot of ripe fruit sitting out in the garden or in the field, the SWD are going to be attracted to that ripe fruit. They do not like fruit that's unripe nearly as well. So if you can be getting out there daily and harvesting fruit that's becoming ripe, that will be helpful. Even if you can harvest a little bit before your berries are ripe, especially with something like strawberry where that is an option. It may not be quite as fun to eat, but you might be able to miss an SWD infection that way. Also, refrigerating the berries after they're harvested, because SWD larvae are actually not dangerous to eat. You can eat berries that have SWD larvae in them. So if you can refrigerate berries immediately after harvesting them and keep them refrigerated, it'll stop that decomposition and the berries from getting mushy, even if they do have larvae inside of them. If you do have a high tunnel, there's research going on at our university and others that's showing that they may not like high tunnel environments as much because they don't like the high temperatures that can be sustained in a high tunnel environment. So, there's a lot more I could say on that topic, but you can ask questions too. So I'll move on to the Japanese beetle slide. Japanese beetles, everybody saw Japanese beetles this summer. They were everywhere, like they often are. So the
picture on the left is a picture of a couple beetles on a grapevine leaf. When I went to this vineyard, I was sampling from the vines, and I was just being covered by Japanese beetles falling all over me, so that was a good memory. But they are often seen in large quantities, and the reason for this is that once the Japanese beetle starts feeding off of a tree or off of a grapevine or even a vegetable plant, which they sometimes do, they start sending off a pheromone, and this attracts other beetles to the area. So you often won't just see one, you'll see many. And they can destroy whole plants if they are allowed to, and if they have big populations. So this can really be a challenge with something like an apple tree that is too tall to realistically be able to brush all of them off or even spray all of them off if you are using a pesticide approach. So this can be a real challenge for fruit growers.
Hey,
there's a lot of talk around using traps for Japanese beetles. Research so far has been showing that those traps, while they can be effective for scouting and seeing how many Japanese beetles are present, the amount of the beetles that are caught in the traps cannot come close to the amount that will congregate in the area. So there have been findings that actually putting those traps out will actually just serve to attract more beetles to the area rather than using them as a control mechanism. And I have heard individuals say that they put traps in their yards and it seemed to work for them. It's just that the research that is going on is not showing that. It's so far showing that those traps are just attracting more beetles or just not having an effect. There's another method that I heard about this summer, actually on one of the news stations, that nematode or biocontrol treatments can be used to prevent Japanese beetle populations next year. And so this is something that I want to address. How this treatment is supposed to work is that the nematodes are released into the soil and they eat the Japanese beetle grubs that are in the soil. So that would prevent the Japanese beetles from coming out of the soil and eating the trees next year. The problem with this is that even if they kill the Japanese beetles that are directly around your trees in your yard, more Japanese beetles can easily come in from other places. So there is not strong evidence in the research that this treatment is effective and can't really effectively prevent Japanese beetle infestations for next year. So unless the grubs are really eating up your lawn, I wouldn't recommend using that nematode treatment at this point in time. There's a lot of research going on at the university about Japanese beetle. So if you want to listen to a podcast episode that we did talking to Jeff Hahn and Dominika Benga on this topic, two of the people at the university doing research on Japanese beetle, you can find that on Fruit Edge, UMN Fruit Edge. The podcast series is called What's Killing My Kale. So that's a good place to learn more about Japanese beetle. All right. So the next one.
So before we go to the next one, we have a question about SWD.
Okay.
Somebody would like to know if they overwinter in the soil.
So the short answer is that we're not sure yet, actually. In other parts of the country, they can certainly overwinter in dead plant matter, but we're not sure if they can survive our winters in Minnesota yet. And Bill Hutchinson's lab at the university is doing research on this. Mary Meyer's lab as well, and they're leaning towards saying they probably might be able to overwinter in certain microclimates where the soil might be warmer, but we really don't know for sure yet. So far, you know, if they're not overwintering, that means that they're migrating into the state every year. The peak season that we start seeing them, well, we start seeing them around mid-June, and then the peak season is about the beginning of July. All right, and then I also included a couple of things here in the next two slides that look like they're pest damage, but they're actually not. So this one here is blossom end rot on bell peppers. This can happen in an open field or a garden setting or in a high tunnel setting. So blossom end rot is caused, basically what it is the pepper fruit or the tomato fruit is not actually getting enough calcium. And this doesn't necessarily mean that there's not enough calcium in the soil, because often in Minnesota we actually have a lot of calcium in our soils. What it means is that it's just not getting to the fruit. And often the reason for this is that maybe there's uneven watering, there's just not enough water being taken up by the plant, and so that is preventing that calcium from getting into the fruit, and so it causes this really odd looking scarring, and it can look like it was caused by a fungal pathogen, but it actually was not. So the control recommendation for this is, in general, just to try to water more evenly. If you're using drip irrigation, it can commonly happen at the end of a drip irrigation because at the end it's not watering as evenly. So just trying to go out there regularly will help. All right, and the next one. This is another weird thing that I saw quite a lot this summer. This is also something that is not a pest, but it looks very concerning. These are called aerial roots, and these are on grapevines. Aerial roots come out of the shoots or the branches on a grapevine, and you can see big patches like this. There's just a couple coming out. And the reasons why these occur are not completely understood, but basically what's known is that they are a stress response, and they can happen when there's too much moisture, too much humidity in the air around the vines, and there's also evidence showing that they can happen in the spring if there's a late frost that causes winter injury on the grapevines. So I saw a lot of those, and if you have grapevines at home and you see aerial roots, what I would say is that this might be a sign that the environment that the grapevines are growing in is not ideal. It's a little too wet, or they had winter damage. So it's just take it as a sign that the vine isn't totally happy, but it can still produce just fine even with these roots on it.
Okay, that wraps up our little presentations from our experts here. I would like to provide enough time for everybody to submit your questions, tell us what's going on in your farm or your garden, and we'll see if we can figure out how we can help. So any of you joined more recently, if you look at the bottom right or the right-hand side, and you don't know where the chat is, it should say participants on top and then chat on the bottom. If you can't see it, you can click the little arrow on chat and it will open it up, and you'll be able to type in the chat box. So please go ahead and do so and throw your questions at us. I'll give you a few minutes.
Greg, I'd like to just add to what Annie was talking about on two of her slides, the spotted winged Drosophila. One of the ways that we've been able to really control those, and on a raspberry specifically, is when we're harvesting them. We harvest them 3 times a week, and as we're harvesting them, you can pull the fruits off and you can actually tell when they're soft and they have a larva inside, and then drowning those fruits immediately, letting them sit for at least 24 hours in soapy water to get rid of the insects, and that helps sort of curtail the population from booming up. And so we've been able to have pretty good luck controlling spotted winged Drosophila. Usually by the time we're in that last like 20% of the crop, the spotted wing is taking more of the crop than it isn't, but you can get to that 80% of the crop harvested without a ton of infestation with that. And then the other thing that I would add with the Japanese beetles, we had Japanese beetles totally try to annihilate our strawberries this year, and I actually bought one of those little hand vacuums that just has like the same battery pack that you put on like your cordless drill, and actually was able to go out and suck up tons of Japanese beetles, and it seemed like once we removed them the first time, they didn't really come back, and we just dumped them into the soapy water and drowned them, and that was a good way to sort of collect them in mass easily.
I really like that idea. That sounds a lot faster than flicking them off by hand, and you might be able to reach some you wouldn't be able to.
Definitely.
So can feeding infested berries to chickens work as well as soapy water?
I would say that it definitely, yeah, for the berries, sure, you could totally feed the berries to the chickens instead. We do that every once in a while.
You just don't want to leave the infected berries in a pile outside or something, because then the larvae can still get out of those and grow up and reinfest.
Yep. So feed them to hungry chickens.
Yeah, exactly.
So for the Japanese beetles, are there any trap crops or anything that you can put out? Is there something that if they really like something, they'll stay there and not go to your other crops?
That's not totally known yet, as far as I know from talking to people who are researching this, because that's a question about like what crops do they prefer over others. And that's something that the research is going that direction. They're trying to figure it out, but we're not sure yet. I mean, right now it's just a lot of anecdotal evidence of it seems like Japanese beetles went after some apple trees and not others next to them, but we're really not sure yet enough to recommend a trap crop.
One trap crop that I've tried is 4 o'clocks. Supposedly, like 4 o'clocks are attractive to the Japanese beetles, but they're also supposed to be toxic. I haven't seen a ton of Japanese beetles on the 4 o'clocks when we've tried this, but we've tried like interplanting, putting like a row of 4 o'clocks in between like soybeans or edamame that's supposed to be super susceptible, and it's kind of hit or miss. So yeah, I don't know that it's a clear option, but
yeah. I mean, there's only been one study that we were able to find on the 4 o'clocks, and in that one study they didn't find any difference. So yeah, I'm not sure.
All right. Hey, Courtney, your thistle issue. So I'm wondering, are there any thistles that we don't really have to worry about? I know there's native thistles and there's bull thistle and Canada thistle and all that. There's some thistles out there, if we see them, we can just kind of go work around them? Or should we really go in and try to get rid of all of them?
Canada thistle is definitely the worst because it spreads by rhizomes. I mean, bull thistles aren't really fun to work around, so I would get rid of those too. Those are probably the 2 main ones that I see and seem to inundate the most. But yeah, the Canada thistle is the worst for sure. Stay on top of that one as best you can.
All right. Oh, here's a comment. The evening primrose around my field are covered in Japanese beetles in the morning, and I go to them first with my bucket of soapy water in the morning. So that's an interesting, if you could get them, say, like one thing in the morning, you can go get them early and kill them all before they can move around your fields.
They're definitely the least active in the early in the morning and at dusk. Like they're the most active in the middle of the day when the sun is high. So yeah, that's a really good tactic. A lot of times I'll go around with a bucket of soapy water to the fruit trees and just like hit the branches into the soapy water, and they just fall in first thing in the morning or at dusk. So that's definitely a good tactic.
All right. Is there anything that we can be doing to prepare our beds or the fields right now for next year so that our pests don't survive over winter if you live in the part of the state that's not covered in snow at the moment?
Michelle, do you want to take that one?
Sure.
Sounds like it's about diseases.
Yeah, so with a lot of our plant disease or plant pathogens, if you have infected plant material, it can, the pathogen will survive from one season to the next, often protected within that plant material. And I think I pointed out a couple of the exceptions, like the late blight and the basal downy mildew don't survive so well, but many of our common leaf spot diseases do pretty well. So if you have a very large area, you want to bury that crop residue as soon as possible so the composting microorganisms in the soil can start breaking down that plant debris. But if you do that, then the goal would be to use also rotation. So if you're burying infected tomato leaves, you don't want to plant next year into that same soil. You want to move to a new location and put plants from a different family, like a cucurbit or a brassica, in that area. if you have a really small area, like inside of a high tunnel or smaller raised beds or something like that, and you have a lot of diseased plant material, it can be a good idea to actually remove the plant material from that area so that you're not putting that plant material back into the soil. So if you think you're not going to be able to rotate, and it's feasible to remove that plant material, then go ahead and pull that out. And many of our plant pathogens will actually be killed by composting as long as the compost heats up. So we're looking for around like 148 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 weeks. So it's got to be enough heat to completely break down that plant material so that you don't see chunks of stems and leaves, but it just looks like an organic compost at the end of it. There's a few exceptions. The tomato mosaic virus, tobacco mosaic virus are kind of tough and can make it through compost, but many of our common fungal bacterial leaf spot diseases break down just fine in compost.
All right, here's a question. Are infected vegetables with fungus harmful if eaten? Like, for example, the basil leaves bought in the store.
Harmful is a difficult question to answer because, of course, every human being is unique in what we react to and how our own bodies react to things in our environment, things that we eat. The main concerns that we have with plant pathogens, for example, if you had tomatoes that had some spots on it, you could cut out those bad parts and keep the healthy parts to use for cooking and things like that. We know that when a tomato fruit is infected, it can affect the acidity of that tomato. So even a tomato with just one little small spot on it, we don't want to use that for canning. Not because that small spot is going to be harmful, but if we don't get the acidity that we need to make the canning successful, we could have food pathogens come in from that end of it. The basil leaves, if they're in the store and they're covered in spores, chances are you're not going to want to eat them simply because of the texture and sort of palatability of that. In many cases, if it's at such a low level that you can't notice the infection, then it's not, they're not directly toxic. The pathogens are often not directly toxic to humans for the pathogens that we get on vegetables. There's a few grain pathogens that can create what are called mycotoxins, but those are not normally ones that you would find in a vegetable production type field.
So can we eat Colorado beetles?
Ew.
Ew.
That'd be up to you.
All right, let's see. What about chickens in the orchard and places? Does that work for a lot of pest control for keeping bugs out of things? They eat around the ground at night. I guess they sleep at night. So.
Well, it depends on if you want to really do that. It depends on where the chickens are. I mean, if you put chickens in a vineyard, they're going to eat all the grapes, because they can get up in the canopy of the orchard. So if you put them in a raspberry patch, they're probably going to eat your raspberries too. But then you could put them in earlier in the season to get stuff when you don't have berries on there.
You've also got like the manure rule, where you have to keep in mind for the food safety or the organic standards, where basically it says you can't apply raw manure to a soil where you're going to harvest if the crop is touching the soil within 120 days and 90 days if it's not touching the soil. So you have to keep that in mind. Like, even if you're just letting the chickens in, they are going to poop somewhere.
So that counts for things that aren't ground harvested as well.
Right. Yep. It's 90 days for things that are not touching the ground. So you have to keep the chickens out for 90 days before you're going to harvest the crop. So it's important to think about.
Yeah.
So what amount of weed pressure in your veggies is okay? What can we get away with before it starts really competing?
That's a great question. That varies depending on the crop. And for some vegetables, there's a lot of data on that. And for a lot of them, there's not. But in general, you really want to keep weeds out during the earlier part of a vegetable plant's growth. So let's take cucumbers as an example because it's kind of easy to picture. If you've got a cucumber plant, the cucumber plant kind of grows slowly for a while, and then after about 4 or 6 weeks, it starts vining out and getting really big and sprawling. For that time before it starts vining out, that's a really critical time to control weeds because one weed can have a pretty big impact on the plant's growth if it's a big, fast-growing weed. Yeah, we just don't have a lot of specific numbers about weed counts for vegetables. But I would just focus on controlling weeds for the first few weeks of a vegetable plant's growth in general.
Another piece on weed control is that many weeds that are in the same plant family as the crop can harbor some plant pathogens. So, for example, shepherd's purse is in the same family as broccoli and cabbage, and the bacteria that causes black rot can be harbored on some of the brassica weeds and then get splashed into the crops. So you do want to particularly pay attention to weeds that are near the crop that are in the same plant family, as they are more likely to harbor plant diseases. And then weeds that are kind of crowding the plant and making the humidity of the plant canopy higher can increase some of those leaf spot diseases as well.
All right. Does buckwheat choke out crabgrass as well as the thistles?
In my experience, buckwheat is a really good smother crop, and it'll smother out lots of things, including, I haven't tried it specifically for crabgrass, but I think it'd be worth a try.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any ideas for keeping deer out of your garden?
You can put up a deer fence.
Other than a $20,000 deer fence?
Yeah. If it's a garden, so an actual small-scale garden, okay, so if the garden is really narrow, and you have like a 5 or 6 foot fence around it, the deer is going to be less encouraged to jump into it because it might look at it and go, oh, if I jump into that, I'm just going to hit the fence on the other side.
Okay.
But if your garden's more than 12 feet across, then that won't work.
All right.
Does anybody else have any ideas for deer other than fencing?
Heard of an egg mix, like putting eggs on, like getting a dozen eggs and beating them and mixing them with water and then like glazing things. I think more for perennials.
Mm.
All right, so what about the apple splotch, the sooty blotch? Somebody want to tell me about that?
Yeah, so Michelle can help me with this one, but I'll just tell the story. I got a question on Twitter yesterday. Somebody sent me a picture of a healthy-looking apple and an apple next to it that was almost completely black. And so he was asking me what was going on with that. And it's actually what looks like sooty blotch. And I asked a few apple experts too, and they agreed that it looked like sooty blotch. So this is a fungal disease that Michelle can maybe chime in and tell you about.
Right. Yeah, so I would say it's a pretty extreme case of sooty blotch. I only got to see the picture just an hour ago. But there are two fungi that we see, that there's sooty blotch and there's fly speck, and they actually colonize the waxy cuticle of the fruit. So they're not going to cause the apple fruit to be rotted. They're not really going to degrade the quality of the apple. It's almost cosmetic. But in cases like this one, it can be quite dramatic. And so there's several different fungi that cause it. And they'll colonize that waxy cuticle. And in some cases, when it's just getting started, you'll see kind of grayish blotches, kind of small feathery spots all over the fruit. In this case, it was large, big patches had grown together to kind of cover that waxy coating. In many cases, sooty blotch, you can actually rub it off, but the fly speck, those are more, they're actually little groupings of tiny little black dots. And those little groupings are called the fly speck, and those unfortunately do not rub off. But again, they don't actually cause rot. They don't get into the actual fruit itself, and so they're pretty much cosmetic, and it's okay to use those fruit for cooking and for eating.
All right. Let's see. Anybody, if you have any last-minute questions, we're running out of time, so please get them in there. While you're doing that, I'll let you know that the things that you need to do next, or that we would really like you to do next, is to fill out the evaluation. I believe Anna Peterson will be sending you all a link to the evaluation. Please go ahead and fill it out. We also have a Facebook group for Local Foods College, so you can check that out. And you can tweet at local or hashtag Local Food College, at RSDP, at UMN Small Farms. And then please also continue to join us next week. Our next session will be with Annalisa Holtberg and Valerie Gamble, who know more about food safety than anyone I've ever met before in my life. They'll be leading a session on FSMA and the food safety introduction. So you can come explore the intersections between farm food safety and local foods with Minnesota Department of Agriculture. But, you know, you can read all that stuff. But anyway, get yourself up to speed on FSMA, GAPS training, all that stuff, the Food Safety Modernization Act, meaning FSMA. And have a great session, and then thank you very much, and have a great rest of your evening. Please fill out that evaluation, and that's, I think, all we have for today. So I'd like to thank our participants here, Annie Klodd, Courtney Tchida, Michelle Grabowski of Extension, and the Student Organic Farm. So I think that's all. I will talk to y'all next year when we do this again, or next week.